They put me in a nursing home. So I bought the land. It was built on the papers arrived on a Wednesday. I was sitting in the common room of Riverside Care Residence, watching dust move through afternoon light, when the courier found me. Heavy stock paper, the kind that meant something had concluded. I signed for the envelope with my good hand and waited until I was alone in my room before I opened it. Inside was the deed transfer. 3 acres of commercially zoned land in my name, purchased through an LLC I had incorporated 2 months prior. The building I was sitting in, the one my children had deposited me into like unwanted furniture, was now mine. Every brick, every fluorescent bulb, every locked door. I set the papers on my narrow bed and looked out the window at the parking lot where my daughter's SUV had disappeared 6 weeks ago. The tremor in my left hand had started 18 months before any of this. Small at first, a coffee cup that rattled against its saucer. My son noticed it during Sunday dinner, the last one we would have for a long while, though I did not know that then. He glanced at my wife's empty chair, then at my hand, and something shifted in his face. Calculation, maybe. The kind of look you see in a chess player who has just spotted an opening. My daughter noticed it too, a week later, when she stopped by unannounced. She watched me sign a check for the lawn service and asked if I had thought about what would happen if things got worse. I told her I was 73, not incapacitated. She smiled the way people do when they have already made a decision for you. My wife died in October, 60 years together, and then she was gone between one breath and the next. The house became too quiet after that. I kept her routines out of habit, making enough coffee for 2, setting the table with both placemats. The tremor worsened. My doctor said it was essential tremor, not Parkinson's, something manageable with medication and patience. But my children had already stopped listening to what I said. They had started listening to what they wanted to hear. The shift was gradual, then sudden. My son began calling every other day, asking the same questions. Had I eaten? Had I taken my pills? Was I sure I did not need help? My daughter started appearing with groceries I had not asked for, rearranging my kitchen, talking about me as if I were not in the room. They consulted with each other in hushed voices in the hallway, voices that went silent when I approached. In January, my son suggested I sign a power of attorney, just as a precaution. He had the forms already printed. I told him no. He did not argue. He simply folded the papers and put them back in his briefcase. And I watched his jaw tighten the way it used to when he was 16, and I refused to co-sign for a car he could not afford. The house was paid off. 3,200 square feet in a neighborhood that had quietly appreciated over the decades. My wife and I had bought it in 1978 for $41,000. It was worth $700,000 now, maybe more. We had raised 2 children there, survived 3 recessions, repainted every room at least twice. It was mine. But I could see the way they looked at it now. Not as a home, but as equity, as inheritance they were tired of waiting for. February brought the intervention. That is what my daughter called it, though the word felt false in her mouth. She and my son arrived together on a Saturday morning with a woman I had never met. They introduced her as a care consultant. She had a leather portfolio and a sympathetic smile that did not reach her eyes. They sat me down at my own kitchen table and explained that they were worried. The tremor, the isolation, the house too big for one person. My daughter cried. Real tears, I think, though I could not be sure anymore what was real and what was performance. My son stayed calm, reasonable. He laid out a plan, a nice facility, very clean, where I could have my own room and meals prepared and people to check on me. Just for a while, he said. Just until we figured things out. I asked what would happen to the house. My son glanced at the consultant, then back at me. "We would handle it," he said. "Keep it maintained. Maybe rent it out to cover costs." I asked if they had already picked a place. My daughter reached across the table and put her hand on mine, the one that shook. "Dad," she said, "we are trying to help you." The facility was 40 minutes away. Riverside Care Residence. I looked it up that night on the computer my wife had taught me to use before she died. The reviews were mixed. The photos looked sterile. I called my doctor the next morning and asked him point blank if I needed to be in a care facility. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said no, not in his medical opinion, but that these decisions were often made by families for complex reasons. I thanked him and hung up. I could have fought them, could have refused outright, called a lawyer, made it difficult. But I had learned patience over 7 decades. I had learned that sometimes you let people reveal themselves fully before you respond. So I agreed. I told my children I would go, that maybe they were right, that I was tired of being alone in the house. My daughter hugged me. My son shook my hand and told me I was making the right choice. The consultant smiled and said she would handle the arrangements. They moved me in on a Thursday. 1 suitcase of clothes, a few books, a photograph of my wife. My son drove. My daughter followed in her SUV to drive him back. They walked me to my room, which smelled of bleach and something floral meant to cover it. The bed was narrow, the window faced a parking lot, and the door had a lock that only worked from the outside. "For safety," the nurse explained. I nodded. My children stayed for 20 minutes, making sure I was settled. They promised to visit soon. My daughter kissed my cheek. My son said he would take care of everything. Then they left, and I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to their footsteps fade down the linoleum hallway. That night, I could not sleep. The walls were too thin. I heard a man crying 2 rooms down, heard the murmur of nurses changing shifts, heard a television no one was watching. At 2 a.m, I got up and walked the halls. The front doors were locked. A night attendant asked if I was all right. I told him I was just stretching my legs. He nodded and went back to his phone. I returned to my room and sat by the window until dawn, watching cars pass on the distant road, feeling the shape of what my children had done. The first week I observed. I learned the routines, the shift changes, the names of the staff who cared and the ones who were counting hours. I learned which residents had family who visited and which had been forgotten. I attended the required activities, ate the meals, took my medication. I was polite and compliant and entirely invisible. And I thought. My wife had been the organized one, the keeper of files and records, but I had learned from her. After she died, I went through everything. Bank statements, investment accounts, insurance policies. We had lived modestly and saved aggressively. The house was not our only asset. There was a brokerage account my children did not know about, one we had opened in the 70s and fed steadily. There was a pension from my 30 years at the utility company. There was Social Security. All of it direct deposited into accounts my children had never asked about because I had never volunteered the information. I had access to a computer in the facility's common room, 1 hour a day. I used it to check my accounts. Everything was still there, untouched. My son had not tried for power of attorney again. Perhaps he thought he did not need it. Perhaps he thought I was sufficiently stowed away. I opened a new email account that week, one they would not think to monitor. I began to research. By the second week, I had the full picture. My son had listed the house for rent the day after they moved me into Riverside. I found the listing online. Charming family home in desirable neighborhood. Available March 1st. I looked at the photographs he had posted. The rooms I had lived in for 47 years, staged now like a showroom. My wife's garden visible through the kitchen window. The rental price was $2,800 a month. I did the arithmetic. Enough to cover the facility's fees with a margin left over. Neat, efficient. They were turning my life into a revenue stream. I did not confront them. I did not call. I waited. In the third week, my daughter visited. She brought flowers and small talk, and a distracted energy that suggested obligation rather than desire. She asked how I was adjusting. I told her fine. She said the house was being taken care of. I thanked her. She stayed for 30 minutes and left with visible relief. I watched her SUV pull out of the parking lot and wondered if she felt anything resembling guilt. That afternoon, I used my computer hour to search property records. Riverside Care Residence sat on 3 acres of land at the eastern edge of the county. The facility itself was only 8 years old, built by a regional healthcare company that had since been absorbed by a larger corporation. The land, however, was owned separately, a small real estate holding company based 2 states away. I dug deeper. The holding company was thinly capitalized, a vehicle for a single asset. The contact information led back to a semi-retired developer who had built the facility and retained the land as an income generator. The lease agreement between the landowner and the healthcare corporation was public record. 20-year term, triple net lease. Annual rent of $96,000. It renewed automatically unless terminated with 18 months' notice. I read that lease 3 times. Then I began making phone calls. The developer's name was Harlan Griggs. I reached him on the 4th try. He sounded old and surprised to hear from anyone. I introduced myself as a private investor exploring commercial real estate opportunities. I asked if he had any interest in selling the Riverside property. He was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed, a dry rasp over the phone. "Funny you should call," he said. "I had been thinking about simplifying things. His wife had died last year. His kids were not interested in managing his portfolio. He was tired. I asked what he wanted for it. He gave me a number. $675,000. I told him I would need to review the lease terms and the title. He said fine. We agreed to talk again in a week. I spent that week working the problem like an equation. I had enough liquid assets to cover the purchase if I was careful. I would need to move money, establish the LLC, arrange financing to avoid liquidating everything at once. I would need a lawyer I could trust, one who did not know my children. I found one in the nearest city, a woman in her 50s who specialized in elder law and real estate. I called her from the facility's payphone during an afternoon when the staff was distracted by a minor emergency involving a resident's medication. I explained what I wanted to do. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked me one question. "Do your children have any legal authority over your finances?" I said no. She said she would take the case. The mechanics took 4 weeks. I moved money in increments small enough not to trigger alerts. I signed documents my attorney couriered to the facility, timed to arrive when my children were not visiting. I used a notary who worked part-time at Riverside, a kind woman in her 60s who treated residents like people. She notarized my signatures without asking questions I did not want to answer. The LLC was incorporated in Delaware. The purchase agreement was structured as an all-cash offer with a 30-day close. Harlan Griggs accepted without counteroffer. He sounded relieved. During this time, my children visited rarely. My son came twice, both visits under 20 minutes. My daughter came once, distracted by her phone, talking about her own children and their activities in a way that felt like filler. Neither of them asked about my finances. Neither of them asked if I needed anything beyond what the facility provided. They had placed me here, and that, it seemed, was the extent of their concern. I did ask my daughter, during that last visit, if anyone had rented the house yet. She brightened. "Yes," she said. "A lovely couple, moving in next month." It was such a relief, she said, knowing the house would be lived in and cared for. I nodded. I told her that was good. She squeezed my hand, the one that shook, and told me not to worry about anything. The closing happened on a Monday. My attorney handled everything remotely. The wire transfer went through at 11 in the morning. By noon, I owned the land beneath Riverside Care Residence. I sat in the common room and watched the residents around me. Some were lost to dementia. Some were simply old and had nowhere else to go. Some, like me, had been placed here by families who found them inconvenient. I wondered how many of them knew that the building they lived in was barely tethered to the ground it sat on, held there by a lease agreement that could be altered or terminated by whoever owned the dirt. I did not tell anyone right away. I wanted to understand my position fully before I moved. I reviewed the lease with my attorney over the phone during evening hours when the facility was quiet. The healthcare corporation operating Riverside was obligated to maintain the property and pay rent quarterly. If they failed to pay, I could initiate eviction proceedings under commercial tenancy laws. If I chose not to renew the lease in 10 years, they would need to relocate or negotiate new terms. The lease was airtight in my favor, written by lawyers who assumed the landowner would always be a passive entity, interested only in rent checks. But I was not passive, and I was not interested in simply collecting rent. I waited 2 weeks after the closing before I made my next call. This one was to the regional director of the healthcare corporation. I introduced myself as the new owner of the land under Riverside. There was a pause, then a flurry of questions. How did I acquire it? Was I planning any changes? Did I understand the terms of the lease? I answered each question calmly. I had purchased it through a private sale. I was not planning immediate changes. I understood the lease perfectly. Then I asked my own question. How often did they perform facility inspections? The director hesitated. Annual state inspections, she said, plus internal reviews. I thanked her and ended the call. That night, I wrote a letter. It was addressed to my son and daughter, care of my old address, the house they had rented out from under me. I wrote it by hand on plain paper, my tremor making the lines waver but the words clear. I explained what I had done. I explained that I now owned the property they had placed me on. I explained that I had done this not out of anger, but out of a need to regain control over my own life, something they had taken from me under the guise of care. I did not threaten, I did not plead, I simply informed them. I sealed the letter and gave it to a staff member I trusted to mail it. Then I waited. The response took 3 days. My son arrived first, alone, his face red before he even reached my room. He closed the door behind him. His voice was low and furious. What did I think I was doing? Did I understand what I had risked? I was vulnerable, he said. I was being taken advantage of. He demanded to know who had helped me, who had put this idea in my head. I let him finish. Then I told him I had acted alone, with full mental clarity, and that every document was properly executed and filed. I told him that I was not vulnerable. I was deliberate. He stared at me. Then he said I was being manipulated. I asked by whom. He did not have an answer. My daughter came the next day. She cried again. She asked why I was doing this to them. I pointed out that I had not done anything to them. I had purchased property with my own money. She said it felt like punishment. I asked what I was punishing them for. She did not answer directly. Instead, she talked about how hard it had been to make the decision to move me here, how much they worried, how they were only trying to help. I listened. When she finished, I asked her why they had not consulted me before renting my house. She blinked. "It was for the best," she said, "to cover expenses." I asked which expenses. The silence stretched long enough to answer. Over the following weeks, the dynamic changed. My children visited more often, but the tone was different. Careful. Tentative. They asked about my health with renewed attention. They brought things I had not asked for, small gifts that felt like offerings. My son mentioned, casually, that they could move me back home if I wanted. The renters could be given notice. I told him I was fine where I was for now. He nodded, and I saw him recalculate behind his eyes. I was not interested in revenge. I was interested in boundaries. For months, I had been treated as an object to be managed, a problem to be solved. My children had made decisions about my life, my home, my future, without my input. They had assumed I was too diminished to resist. The land purchase was not a weapon. It was a statement. I was still here. I was still capable. And I would not be discarded. But the land gave me leverage, and I intended to use it. Not to punish, but to restructure. I scheduled a meeting with both of them at the facility, in a private conference room typically used for care plan discussions. They arrived together, wary. I had prepared notes. I explained that I had no intention of disrupting the facility's operations. The residents here, myself included, deserved stability. But I also had no intention of pretending the past 6 months had not happened. I laid out terms. They would return control of my house to me. They would provide a full accounting of any rental income collected. And they would stop making decisions on my behalf without consultation. In exchange, I would maintain the lease as written and ensure Riverside continued to operate without interference from me as landlord. My son began to argue. I raised my hand, the steady one. I told him this was not a negotiation, it was an informing. I had already spoken with my attorney. If they contested, I would pursue a formal review of their actions over the past months. I would document everything. The pressure to sign power of attorney, the move to the facility against medical advice, the rental of my home without consent. None of it was criminal, but all of it would look damning in the right context. My daughter went pale. My son's jaw worked, but no sound came out. They agreed. The house was returned to my name within 2 weeks. The renters were given 60 days' notice. My children provided an accounting. They had collected 1 month's rent, which they returned in full. I accepted it without comment. I did not move back into the house immediately. I was not ready to be alone there yet. But knowing it was mine again, truly mine, settled something inside me. I remained at Riverside for another 3 months. During that time, I paid attention to the facility in a way I had not before. I noticed things: the staffing shortages, the corners cut in maintenance, the way certain residents were ignored because they had no family to complain. I made notes. I had a quiet conversation with the regional director, in my capacity as landowner. I suggested that certain improvements would be appreciated. She listened. Some changes began to appear. Small ones. A new nurse on the night shift. Repairs to the heating system that had been delayed. Better food. It was not transformation, but it was movement. In June, I moved back into my house. My son and daughter helped me, their movements stiff and mechanical. We did not speak much. They left quickly once the furniture was arranged. I stood in the kitchen and looked at my wife's garden, overgrown now but still recognizable. The tremor in my hand was the same. The silence was the same. But I was not the same. I hired a part-time caregiver, someone to check in 3 times a week, help with tasks that had become difficult. I sold the Riverside land 6 months later to a non-profit organization that specialized in senior care reform. I made a small profit, which I donated to a legal aid fund for elder advocacy. The facility continued to operate under new management with better oversight. I had no interest in being a landlord. I had only needed to prove I could be. My children and I are cordial. Now. They visit on holidays. We do not discuss what happened. There is no apology, and I do not expect one. They acted out of a combination of greed and convenience, wrapped in a thin layer of concern. I acted out of self-preservation and dignity. Both things can be true. I do not hate them, but I do not trust them the way I once did. That is simply how it is now. I think about my wife often. She would have handled this differently, with more grace and less calculation. But she also would have never let it get this far. She had a way of setting boundaries gently but absolutely. I learned that from her, though it took me too long to apply it. I wish she were here to see how it ended. I think she would be proud, or at least understanding. The house is mine. My choices are mine. The tremor is still there, a small earthquake in my left hand that comes and goes. But my grip is steady enough. I hold the things that matter, and I have learned when to let go of the rest. That is all any of us can do, in the end. Hold on. Let go. Know the difference. And never let anyone convince you that you are not capable of deciding which is which. The deed to my house sits in a drawer in my study, next to the photograph of my wife on our wedding day. Sometimes I take it out and look at both. Proof of permanence. Proof that some things, if you are deliberate and patient, remain yours no matter who tries to take them. I am 74 now. The world is quieter than it used to be, but it is mine again. And that, I have learned, is enough.